The cafeteria buzzed with the usual lunchtime chaos, but Mai sat in her corner spot, as quiet as a shadow. Her fingers kept running over her violin case, feeling every scratch and dent that told a story of its own. The worn leather handle reminded her of all those early morning practice sessions, and the small scuff near the bottom brought back memories of rushing to catch the school bus. She pulled out her lunch, Mom's special dumplings that normally made her smile. But today they sat untouched. The sound of laughter from the popular table caught her attention. She didn't need to look up to know they were pointing at her again. "There's the music robot," someone whispered loud enough for her to hear. Did she even know how to talk, or does she only speak in violin squeaks? The words stung, but May kept her head down, pretending to read her music sheets. She had arranged them carefully on the table, using her water bottle to keep them from flying away when someone accidentally bumped into her table, which happened at least twice a week. The cafeteria's fluorescent lights flickered above, creating an odd rhythm that only Mai seemed to notice. Even now, her mind was turning that annoying flicker into a potential melody. That's what others didn't get. She heard music in everything. The squeak of shoes on the hallway floor, the clatter of lunch trays, the mumble of voices. It all came together like an urban symphony in her head. Her phone buzzed. Another message in the class group chat that she was still part of, though nobody ever talked to her directly. Someone had shared a meme about orchestra freaks with a crying violin emoji. 20 laugh reactions. She recognized some names, kids who used to be her friends in middle school, before getting into the right crowd became more important than actually being nice to people. A group of prep school kids walked past, their designer shoes squeaking on the linoleum floor. One of them knocked her music sheets with their bag. "Oops, sorry," came the fake apology, followed by poorly hidden snickers. May quickly gathered her papers, some of them now stained with spilled juice. These weren't just any sheets. They were her own compositions, pieces she worked on late into the night when the rest of the world was asleep. In those quiet hours, her small bedroom turned into a studio where she dared to experiment. Classical violin meeting electronic beats, traditional melodies dancing with modern rhythms. Her grandfather, who had played in his city's symphony orchestra back home, would probably raise an eyebrow at her musical experiments. But he had also taught her that music was about feeling something real, about telling stories that words couldn't express. The lunch bell rang, its harsh tone cutting through her thoughts. As everyone rushed to their next class, Meade carefully packed up her violin case. A small smile crossed her face as she remembered what was hidden in the case's secret compartment. A tiny digital mixer she'd saved up for months to buy. They could laugh all they wanted, but they had no idea what was coming. She stood up, straightening her shoulders just a bit. The afternoon sun caught the edge of her violin case, making it shine like a promise. Sure, right now she was just the weird girl who ate lunch alone and talked to her violin. But soon, very soon, they'd hear what she could really do. And maybe then they'd understand that being different wasn't the same as being wrong. Night had settled over the neighborhood like a soft blanket, bringing with it a peaceful quiet that Mai had come to treasure. The converted garage at the back of her grandmother's house glowed with warm light, its windows slightly foggy from the space heater inside. This was her sanctuary, her secret laboratory where magic happened after everyone else went to sleep. The garage didn't look like much from the outside. Peeling paint and a slightly crooked door, but inside it was transformed. Old Chinese opera posters from her grandmother's performing days covered one wall, their faded colors telling stories of packed theaters and standing ovations. A worn but comfortable armchair sat in the corner, where her grandmother would often sit and listen, her eyes closed and a gentle smile on her face. Tonight, Mai sat cross-legged on the floor, surrounded by a mess of cables and equipment. Her laptop screen cast a blue glow over her face as she adjusted settings on her music production software. Next to her, her violin waited patiently on its stand, but this wasn't going to be another practice session of Mozart or Bach. She picked up her violin, letting her fingers find their familiar places. The first few notes were pure classical, a melody that would have made her music teacher smile. But then her foot tapped a pedal, and suddenly the sound transformed. The violin's sweet voice began to dance with electronic beats that pulsed from small speakers. She had spent weeks getting this part right, the moment where traditional met modern, where past and future became friends instead of enemies. Her grandmother's voice drifted in from the doorway. "That doesn't sound like the piece for your recital next week." There was no judgment in her voice, only curiosity. She walked in, her slippers making soft shuffling sounds on the concrete floor, and settled into her armchair. "It's something new I'm trying," Maya explained, lowering her violin. "Do you think it's too weird?" Her grandmother laughed, the sound warm and rich like honey and tea. "Weird? When I first joined the opera, they said I was weird too. My voice was different, not traditional enough. But that difference became my strength." She leaned forward, her eyes twinkling. "Show me more of what you're creating." Mee grinned and picked up her violin again. This time, she played a piece inspired by one of her grandmother's old opera songs, but reimagined with subtle electronic undertones. The melody soared and dipped, carrying with it echoes of both past and present. Through her laptop, she added layers of sound. A gentle drumbeat here, a synthetic harmony there, all weaving together like threads in a tapestry. Her grandmother closed her eyes, swaying slightly with the music. When the last notes faded away, she opened them again, and Mai saw they were shining with tears. "You found your own voice," she said softly. "Never let anyone tell you that's not valuable." Later that night, as Mai added final touches to her latest composition, she thought about her grandmother's words. At school, she was the quiet girl who didn't fit in, whose passion for music made her an easy target for jokes. But here, in this garage-turned studio, she was an explorer, an inventor, a creator of something new. She saved her work and checked the time. Almost midnight. Tomorrow would bring another day of whispers and stares at school, but somehow they seemed less important now. Let them think she was just practicing the same old classical pieces. Let them believe she was stuck in the past. Soon they would understand that tradition wasn't a cage. It was a foundation to build something entirely new. As she packed up her equipment, her grandmother's opera posters seemed to watch over her with approval. Sometimes the bravest thing you could do was stay true to your own melody, even when everyone else was singing a different song. The rain came down in sheets that afternoon, turning the school parking lot into a maze of puddles. Mai hurried toward her mom's car, clutching her music sheets close to her chest. She was running late after staying behind to practice for the upcoming spring recital, where she was supposed to perform Vivaldi's Winter, a safe, traditional choice that wouldn't raise any eyebrows. That's when she heard the footsteps behind her, followed by the sound she'd grown to dread, snickering. Before she could react, someone bumped into her hard. Her precious sheets slipped from her hands, scattering across the wet pavement like fallen leaves. The rain immediately began turning the papers into soggy mush, bleeding the ink into unreadable smears. "Oops," came a voice dripping with fake concern. The wind must have caught them. More laughter followed as the group of prep school kids walked away, splashing through puddles that soaked the remainder of her music. Maya knelt down, trying to salvage what she could. These weren't just printed sheets. They were her original compositions, works she'd spent months perfecting. Each page represented countless hours of experimentation, of blending classical techniques with modern sounds. Now they lay ruined, her notes dissolving in the rain like sugar in hot tea. As she gathered the wet papers, something inside her shifted. She thought about her grandmother's words about finding her own voice, about all those nights spent creating something unique in that old garage. Why was she still trying to fit into their narrow view of what music should be? The next morning, she stood outside the school office, staring at the talent show sign-up sheet. Her hand trembled slightly as she held the pen. The logical choice would be Vivaldi. Beautiful, safe, expected Vivaldi. Her parents would approve. Her music teacher would beam. Nobody would laugh. But then she thought about the ruined sheets in her backpack, about all the times she stayed quiet when they mocked her, about how it felt to hide her true passion. She thought about her grandmother, who had faced similar choices in her youth and chose to be bold. Taking a deep breath, she wrote down her name. Under performance type, she hesitated for just a moment before writing. Original composition, electronic violin fusion. The hallway was empty except for the gentle hum of fluorescent lights and the distant sound of a gym class. Mai stood there, staring at what she'd written. There would be no turning back now. Her hands shook as she pulled out her phone to text her grandmother. "I did it." The response came almost immediately. "Now the real work begins, little butterfly." That evening, instead of practicing Vivaldi, Mai spent hours in the garage studio, rebuilding her ruined compositions from memory. Each note she wrote felt like an act of defiance. She added new elements, a deeper bass line here, a more complex bridge there. If she was going to risk everything, she would make it count. Her phone buzzed occasionally with messages from the class group chat, discussing who was doing what in the talent show. Someone had already shared that she'd signed up, leading to the usual mocking comments. "What's she going to do? Play Mozart until we fall asleep. Bet she'll wear her grandma's clothes too." But for the first time, their words didn't sting as much. They had no idea what was coming. She looked at her violin, at the small digital mixer hidden in her case, at the LED strips she'd carefully attached to the violin's body. In just a few weeks, they would see her, really see her, for the first time. As night fell, she kept working, fueled by a mixture of nervousness and excitement. The rain had started again, drumming on the garage roof in a steady rhythm. She found herself incorporating that beat into her piece. The sound of rain, of change, of washing away the old and making room for something new. Sometimes the bravest decisions are made on rainy afternoons when you've got nothing left to lose. 2 weeks before the talent show, Mi's bedroom looked like a musical scientist's laboratory. Cables snaked across the floor, connecting her violin to various pieces of equipment. Her normally tidy desk was buried under instruction manuals and YouTube tutorials printed on recycled paper. The wall calendar was covered in notes and reminders, with the talent show date circled in bold red ink. "Just one more try," she mumbled to herself, adjusting the small mixer she'd mounted inside her violin case. It was past midnight, and she'd been at this for hours. The LED strips she'd carefully attached to her violin kept flickering out of sync with the beat. Every time she thought she'd fixed the problem, something else would go wrong. Her grandmother appeared in the doorway with a steaming cup of tea. "The neighbors might start thinking we're having a light show," she said with a gentle smile, setting down the cup. "Though I suppose we are, in a way." Mai sighed, putting down her violin. "Nothing's working right. The lights keep glitching, the sound cuts out randomly, and I can't get the timing perfect with the electronic backtrack." She picked up the tea, letting its warmth seep into her tired hands. Maybe this was a mistake. Her grandmother sat on the bed, patting the space next to her. "You know, before my first big opera performance, I lost my voice completely. Stress, the doctor said. I thought it was a sign to give up." She chuckled at the memory. "But instead, I used those silent days to perfect my movements, my expressions. Sometimes obstacles force us to find new ways forward." Taking her grandmother's advice, Mai spent the next day working on the visual aspects of her performance while giving her fingers a rest. She programmed light patterns that would match specific parts of her music, creating a story through color. Blue for the traditional violin opening, shifting to purple when the electronic elements kicked in, building to a bright gold for the finale. She practiced in front of her mirror, working on her stage presence. No more hunched shoulders or downcast eyes. This performance would be different. Her grandmother helped her modify her violin case, creating hidden compartments for the electronics so everything would look seamless on stage. 1 week before the show, disaster struck. During a practice run, her mixer started smoking slightly, a small electrical short. Panic set in immediately. New equipment would take weeks to arrive, and her savings were already stretched thin. But then her grandmother disappeared into her room and returned with a small wooden box. Inside was a collection of old jewelry and a note that read, "For emergencies." Together, they drove to the music store in the next town over, where they found a better, more reliable mixer. The store owner, intrigued by their unusual request, even stayed late to help them test it properly. 3 days before the show, May overheard some kids in the hallway taking bets on whether she'd chicken out. "Bet she goes back to playing that classical stuff," one said. "No way she actually does something original." She walked past them with her head high, the secret of her preparation tucked safely away in her violin case. The night before the talent show, she did her final rehearsal in the garage. Everything was working perfectly: the lights, the sound, the timing. Her grandmother sat in her usual armchair, but this time she wasn't alone. She'd invited their elderly neighbor who always complained about May's noise. As Mai played through her piece, she saw the neighbor's expression change from skepticism to surprise to something that looked almost like wonder. Later, as she packed up her equipment for the last time before the show, her hands were steady. Fear still fluttered in her stomach, but it was different now, more like anticipation than dread. Her violin, with its hidden lights and modified case, looked innocent enough sitting in the corner. Nobody at school knew that inside that traditional exterior lay something revolutionary. She set her alarm and tried to sleep, but her mind kept racing. Tomorrow, everything would change. Either she'd be known as the girl who dared to be different, or she'd be the girl who failed spectacularly. But as she finally drifted off, she realized something important. Either way, she'd be known for trying something bold, something true to herself. And maybe that was already a kind of victory. The school auditorium hummed with excitement. Backstage, Mai peeked through the heavy curtains at the growing crowd. Her heart was doing a drum solo in her chest as she watched the seats fill up. Teachers chatted in small groups while students jostled for the best spots, their phones already out to record every moment. She spotted her grandmother in the third row, sitting proudly in the blue dress she saved for special occasions. Next to her was the neighbor who'd watched May's final rehearsal, and surprisingly, he was wearing a proper suit. They looked like islands of calm in a sea of teenage energy. The talent show had started with the usual acts: a rock band covering popular songs, a few dance routines, someone doing magic tricks. Mai sat quietly in the wings, running through her mental checklist. She tested her equipment 3 times already, but her hands kept reaching for her violin case, double-checking everything. 2 minutes, the student stage manager whispered, making May jump. She nodded, her throat too dry to speak. Through the curtain, she could hear the current act finishing up. A group doing a hip-hop dance routine that had the crowd cheering. As she waited for her turn, May caught snippets of whispered conversations from the audience. Isn't she the one who always practices alone? Wonder if she'll actually do something different. Bet she backs out and plays Mozart. The stage lights dimmed for the set change. This was it. May took a deep breath and stepped out onto the stage, her violin case held tightly in her hands. The spotlight found her, and for a moment, she was blinded. As her eyes adjusted, she heard the familiar snickers from somewhere in the middle rows. She set her case down and opened it carefully, revealing her violin with its hidden modifications. The stage lights caught the subtle shimmer of the LED strips, but they weren't activated yet. To everyone else, it looked like a regular violin, just as they expected. Mai positioned herself center stage. The microphone picked up the soft sound of her shoes on the wooden floor, amplifying her presence in the quiet room. She lifted her violin to her chin, closing her eyes for just a moment. In that brief darkness, she remembered every lunch spent alone, every whispered joke, every ruined sheet of music in the rain. Her bow touched the strings, and the first notes rang out. Pure, classical violin, just as everyone expected. She could almost feel the audience's collective, "I knew it" sigh. But then, right as they were settling in for what they thought would be another traditional piece, she tapped the hidden pedal with her foot. The LED strips came to life, pulsing a soft blue that matched the gentle electronic beat that began to weave through her violin notes. The classical melody transformed, dancing with synthetic harmonies that filled the auditorium. Colors flowed across her violin like auroras, matching every shift in the music. Someone in the audience gasped. The snickers had stopped completely. May kept playing, her confidence growing with each note. The music swelled, traditional and modern elements swirling together like watercolors. Her bow moved faster, the lights intensified, and the electronic beats grew stronger. She caught glimpses of faces in the audience, wide eyes, open mouths, phones raised to capture the moment. Even the teachers looked stunned. Her grandmother was smiling, tears gleaming in the stage lights. But Maya was no longer playing for any of them. She was playing for herself, telling her story through light and sound. The final section of her piece began, the part she'd rewritten after the rain had ruined her original sheets. It was bolder now, more defiant. The lights on her violin blazed gold, and the music soared. Classical violin and electronic beats didn't just coexist anymore, they became something entirely new. As she played the final notes, the lights on her violin slowly faded like a sunset. The last violin note hung in the air, pure and clear, before dissolving into silence. For a moment, nobody moved. Nobody even seemed to breathe. Then the silence broke, not with polite applause, but with a roar. People were standing, cheering, some even whistling. Phones still recorded, capturing her small, disbelieving smile as she lowered her violin. In the third row, her grandmother was standing too, clapping with tears running down her face. Mai bowed, her heart thundering in her chest. As she straightened up, she caught sight of herself in the stage's back wall mirror. She was glowing, not just from the stage lights, but from somewhere within. The girl in the reflection wasn't the one who ate lunch alone anymore. She was someone new, someone who had found her voice and wasn't afraid to use it. The morning after the talent show felt like waking up in a different world. Mai walked through the school gates, clutching her violin case as usual, but everything else had changed. The first thing she noticed was the silence. Not the cold silence of being ignored, but a new kind of silence filled with curious glances and whispered conversations that stopped being mean-spirited. Her phone hadn't stopped buzzing since last night. The video of her performance, recorded from dozens of angles, was spreading through social media like wildfire. Local music blogs had picked it up, sharing it with captions like, "High school violinist reinvents classical music," and "Watch this mind-blowing fusion performance." As she walked to her locker, someone called out, "Hey, violin girl." She tensed automatically, expecting the worst, but when she turned, she saw genuine smiles. A group of students from the school band approached her, their eyes bright with excitement. "That thing you did with the lights and the electronic beats. It was incredible," one of them said, clutching her flute case. "How did you even come up with that?" Before Mai could answer, more students gathered around. The questions poured out. How long had she been making this kind of music? Could she teach others? Would she perform again? The same people who once mocked her violin practice were now treating her like she held the secrets to musical innovation. During lunch, she couldn't find her usual quiet corner, because it didn't exist anymore. The cafeteria had become a place where people wanted to sit with her, to talk about music, to share their own dreams of trying something different. One boy shyly admitted he'd been mixing classical piano with rap beats in his basement, but had been too scared to tell anyone. Her phone buzzed again. This time, it was an email from a local music producer who had seen her performance video. He wanted to talk about possibilities, recording sessions, collaborations, maybe even an EP. The world she'd created in her grandmother's garage was suddenly expanding beyond anything she'd imagined. After school, Her music teacher caught up with her in the hallway. "You know," he said, adjusting his glasses, "when you first told me you weren't performing Vivaldi, I was worried." He paused, smiling. "I've never been happier to be wrong. Would you consider performing at the spring concert? You could do whatever you want, your way." Walking home, Mai passed by the parking lot where her music sheets had been ruined in the rain. The memory no longer stung. Instead, it felt like the beginning of a story, the moment when everything started to change. Her grandmother was waiting at home with a surprise. She converted more of the garage into a proper studio space. New sound-dampening panels lined the walls, and there was even a small sofa for visitors. "You'll need a proper place to practice now," she said, her eyes twinkling. "I have a feeling you're going to be very busy." That evening, as Mai sat in her enhanced studio space, she opened her laptop to find dozens of messages from other young musicians across the city. They all shared similar stories, feeling trapped by expectations, wanting to try something new but afraid of judgment. They saw her performance as permission to be different, to take risks with their art. She began typing responses, sharing what she'd learned about mixing classical and electronic music. With each message, she felt the walls between musical genres crumbling a little more. One girl wrote about wanting to combine traditional Chinese erhu with electronic dance music. Another talked about adding classical violin to his indie rock band. Looking up from her computer, Mei caught sight of her violin case in the corner. The instrument that had once made her a target of mockery had become a symbol of transformation. But the real change, she realized, wasn't just in how others saw her, it was in how she saw herself. She picked up her violin and began to play, testing out a new melody that had been forming in her mind. Through the garage window, she could see the sunset painting the sky in brilliant colors. Somewhere in the neighborhood, a car stereo was playing hip-hop, and Mai found herself unconsciously weaving its rhythm into her violin notes. Every sound could be part of something beautiful. She'd always known that. Now, finally, others could hear it too. 3 months after the talent show, the school's music room had transformed into something entirely new. Where once stood rigid rows of chairs and music stands, there now was a circle of mixed instruments. Traditional violins and cellos sitting comfortably next to electronic keyboards and mixing boards. Mai stood in the center, helping the younger student adjust the sensitivity on a digital drum pad. "Try it now," she said, stepping back. The student tapped out a rhythm that blended perfectly with the classical piano piece another group was practicing. The sound that filled the room was unlike anything the school had heard before. A beautiful chaos of old and new, traditional and modern, all working together. This was the Music Fusion Club, born from the aftermath of Mei's performance. What started as a few curious students asking for help had grown into something bigger. Twice a week, the room filled with young musicians eager to break boundaries. A cellist was learning to add electronic effects to her classical pieces. 2 violin players were experimenting with hip-hop beats. Even the school's rock band drummer had joined, fascinated by the possibility of mixing traditional Chinese percussion with his modern style. Mei's grandmother often stopped by these sessions, bringing snacks and sharing stories from her opera days. The students loved hearing about how she, too, had once broken traditional boundaries. She'd become a kind of honorary advisor to the club, her presence reminding everyone that innovation didn't mean forgetting your roots. The local music producer who'd contacted Mai had kept his word. Every Saturday morning, she worked in a real recording studio, creating her first EP. The experience had taught her more than just music. She was learning about confidence, about speaking up for her artistic choices, about helping others find their voice. One afternoon, as she was packing up after a club session, her music teacher pulled her aside. "Remember that student who used to eat lunch alone and hide behind her violin case?" He asked with a gentle smile. "I don't see her anymore. Instead, I see a young artist who's helping change how people think about music." Walking home that day, Mai passed a group of younger students practicing in the courtyard. They had propped up their phones to record themselves, just as people had recorded her that night at the talent show. But instead of mockery, they were met with encouragement from passing students. Something fundamental had shifted in the school's atmosphere. At home, she found her grandmother in the garage studio, looking through old photographs. "Look what I found," she said, holding up a faded picture of herself in traditional opera costume. Next to it, she placed a recent photo of Mai performing at a local music festival, her violin glowing with LED lights as she played her fusion pieces. "Different times, same spirit," her grandmother said softly. That evening, as Mai worked on her latest composition, she thought about everything that had changed. Her phone buzzed with messages from club members sharing new musical ideas. Her inbox held inquiries from other schools wanting to start their own fusion music programs. The local arts council had even asked her to perform at their annual youth festival. But the biggest change wasn't in any of these external things. It was in the way she carried herself now, in the way she no longer felt the need to hide who she was. The girl who once ate lunch alone had become someone who helped others find their courage to be different. As she picked up her violin to try out a new melody, she caught her reflection in the studio window. The setting sun painted the sky in brilliant colors, reminding her of the lights on her violin during that first performance. She smiled, remembering how scared she'd been that night. Now she understood that being different wasn't something to fear, it was something to celebrate. Through the window, she could see some of her club members gathering in her driveway for an impromptu practice session. They carried their instruments, a mix of traditional and modern, and their faces were bright with excitement about whatever new sound they would create together. She opened the garage door and welcomed them in, the space that had once been her solitary refuge now filling with laughter and conversation. As they set up their instruments, someone suggested trying to mix a traditional Chinese lullaby with electronic beats. Another proposed adding violin to a popular song they all loved. Mai looked around at these young musicians, none of them afraid to experiment, to fail, to try again. She realized that her story hadn't just been about music. It had been about finding the courage to be yourself, about turning mockery into motivation, about showing others that it was okay to be different. As they began to play together, creating something new and beautiful, Mai knew that this was just the beginning. The music that had once made her an outsider had become a bridge connecting past and present, traditional and modern, silence and sound. And somewhere in that connection, she had found not just her voice, but her purpose.